The silence of a high-security penthouse is shattered at 4:03 a.m. by a vibrating phone, a ghost from the past calling from the brink of a crisis. The screen illuminates a name that shouldn't exist in his world anymore, cutting through his cold discipline like a jagged blade through glass. The phone lit up at 4:03 a.m., its vibration a low snarl against the marble nightstand. Kim Woobin didn't hesitate. Men in his position live by the split-second reaction between life and a shallow grave. As the leader of Seoul's most ruthless syndicate, his reputation alone was enough to silence entire districts, his reach extending from the neon heights of the city to the darkest docks of the harbor. But the caller wasn't a lieutenant reporting a coup or a shipment seized. It was a woman's voice, breathless, weeping, and thick with a desperation that made his ironclad heart stutter for the first time in a year. "Woobin, please," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "It's Stephanie. I'm at the hospital. It's your son. He isn't breathing." 12 months ago, he had watched Stephanie, the only woman who ever saw the man beneath the monster, vanish without a single word. He had convinced himself she was gone forever, a casualty of a life too violent for her light. Now she was pulling him back from the icy abyss of his own making. Before the sentence even finished, Woobin was moving, grabbing his keys and the Glock he never slept without, his mind racing toward a child he never knew existed and a woman he had never stopped mourning. The Mercedes Maybach shrieked to a halt at the entrance of Seoul National University Hospital, the tires smoking against the rain-slicked pavement. Woobin didn't wait for his security detail to open the door. He was a blur of black charcoal wool and cold fury as he stormed through the sliding glass doors. The lobby was a cavern of hushed whispers and antiseptic smells, a world that didn't care about his status or his bank accounts. He reached the private maternity wing on the 4th floor, his boots echoing like gunshots against the linoleum. 2 of his men followed at a respectful distance, their hands hovering near their jackets, sensing the volatile energy radiating from their boss. At the end of the long neon-dimmed corridor, he saw her. Stephanie was a shadow of the vibrant woman he had lost. She was tucked into a high-tech maternity bed, her skin ashen against the white sheets, a clear IV drip feeding into her arm. When she turned her head and saw him, her eyes, dark, liquid, and overflowing with a year's worth of secrets, shattered his remaining composure. She looked small, vulnerable, everything he had sworn to protect and somehow failed. "Woobin," she breathed, her voice cracking. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch her face, checking if she was real or another 4 a.m. "Hallucination. Why did you leave?" he finally managed, his voice a jagged rasp. "I searched every corner of this country." Stephanie's lip quivered, her gaze flickering toward the small, transparent bassinet nestled against the far wall, surrounded by humming monitors and tangled wires. "I didn't have a choice, Woobin. Your world, it was going to swallow us both." Woobin turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. In the small plastic crib lay a tiny, fragile bundle of life. The boy was a perfect miniature mirror of the man standing over him. The same high cheekbones, the same stubborn set of the jaw, but with Stephanie's soft, curling hair. A web of sensors was taped to his chest, the rhythmic beep-beep of the heart monitor, the only thing keeping Woobin's own heart in rhythm. He reached out, his large, calloused hand, a hand that had signed death warrants and crushed rivals, hovering over the infant's tiny fist. The baby's fingers instinctively curled around Woobin's pinky, a grip so light, yet so grounding it felt like a tether to the earth. "His name is Leo," Stephanie whispered from the bed, her tears falling freely now. "He's been fighting since the moment he was born, just like you." The weight of the last 12 months crashed down on him. The anger, the betrayal, and the cold loneliness of his empire evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, primal protective instinct. He looked at the fragile boy, then back at the woman he had never stopped loving. The ivory tower of his syndicate felt like a house of cards. "He's beautiful," Woobin murmured, his eyes never leaving his son. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against the cool plastic of the bassinet. "And no one is ever going to touch either of you again. I don't care who I have to burn to ensure it." The silence of the room was shattered by the heavy swing of the double doors as a team of hospital administrators and 3 men in nondescript gray suits filed in. The lead doctor, a man whose glasses caught the clinical glare of the LED overheads, looked from his clipboard to the armed guards stationed at the door, his face pale but determined. "Mr. Kim, I must insist, this is a restricted neonatal unit. Only immediate family and authorized personnel are permitted. You are not listed on the birth certificate, and your presence is disruptive." Woobin didn't even turn around. He remained anchored to the bassinet, his pinky still held captive by Leo's tiny, translucent hand. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. One of the gray-suited men stepped forward, a legal fixer for the Old Guard, the council of elders that governed the syndicate's shadows. "Woobin," the man said, his voice a low, warning rattle, "your father has been informed of your departure from the summit. He is displeased. A child of unknown origin is a liability, not an heir. We are here to ensure the Kim name is not tarnished by impulsive associations." Stephanie's hand flew to her throat, her IV line rattling against the metal bed frame. The fear in her eyes wasn't for herself, but for the boy in the crib. Woobin finally moved. He stood to his full height, his shoulders broadening as he turned to face the intruders. He didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't need to. The sheer gravity of his presence pushed the administrators back a step. "A liability?" Woobin's voice was a soft, lethal silk. "Look at him. He has my brow. He has my blood. He is not a disruption. He is the only thing in this city that actually belongs to me." He stepped toward the fixer, looming over him until the man had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. "As for the birth certificate, bring it to me now." The doctor stammered, mentioning legal protocols and paternity verifications, but Woobin silenced him with a single icy glance. "I am the law in this district. If you want a blood test, take it from me right now, but know this. If any of you, or the men who sent you, so much as breathe in the direction of this room again, I will burn the Old Guard to the ground before sunrise." He turned back to the bed, reaching down to sign the documents the shaking administrator had produced from a folder. With a sharp, aggressive stroke of the pen, he claimed the boy. "His name is Kim Leo," he announced, the words echoing through the sterile hall like a declaration of war. The fixer narrowed his eyes, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Woobin wasn't just protecting a woman, he was claiming a legacy. "Your father won't accept a half-blood heir, Woobin. This debt of blood will be collected." "Let him try," Woobin replied, his gaze softening only when it landed back on Stephanie. He walked to her side, taking her trembling hand in his and kissing her knuckles. "He isn't a debt to be paid. He's the reason I'm finally closing the ledger." Outside, the rain lashed against the hospital glass, but inside the IV tower, the lines were drawn. The boss was gone. The father had arrived. The storm outside the hospital window seemed to mirror the turbulence in the room as the administrative staff and the Old Guard retreated into the shadows of the hallway. Woobin pulled a chair close to Stephanie's bedside, his movements heavy with exhaustion that had nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with the hollow year he had just endured. He took her hand again, finding it cold, and began to rub warmth back into her skin. "Tell me," he commanded softly, the edge of the Mafia boss softened by the desperation of a man seeking a reason for his own heartbreak. "A year, Stephanie. Not a letter, not a trace. I thought you hated me. I thought the life I led finally made you sick enough to vanish." Stephanie looked at Leo, then back at Woobin, her eyes glistening under the harsh hospital lights. "I never hated you, Woobin. I was terrified for you. And then I was terrified for him. She took a shallow, shaky breath. "The day I left, I didn't go because I wanted to. I was intercepted at the gallery by your father's primary advisor. He didn't come with threats of violence, not at first. He came with photos. Photos of me at the prenatal clinic I'd visited only once. I didn't even have the chance to tell you I was pregnant before they knew." Woobin's jaw tightened, his grip on her hand firming unconsciously. The betrayal by his own blood was a poison he could already feel circulating. "They gave me a choice," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They said a half-blood child was a stain on the Kim succession. If I stayed, they couldn't guarantee the baby would survive the first trimester. They told me that if I truly loved you, I would leave and let you become the leader you were born to be, unburdened by weakness. If I stayed, they would make sure you watched everything you loved burn. I knew your father, Woobin. I knew he wasn't bluffing." She reached out with her free hand, tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone. "I fled to a small clinic in the countryside, changing my name, living like a ghost. I thought if I stayed away, he would be safe, but then the complications started. Leo was coming early, his lungs weren't ready, and the local doctors said he wouldn't make it without the specialists here. I had to choose between my promise to stay hidden and his life." Woobin leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. The year of silence wasn't a desertion, it was a sacrifice. His father had weaponized his love for her to mold him into a cold, solitary king, never realizing that the very weakness he sought to prune had grown into a son who now gave Woobin a reason to tear the old world down. "You were protecting us both," Woobin murmured against her skin. The guilt that had shadowed him for months was replaced by a white-hot, focused clarity. "He thought he was purging my heart. Instead, he's given me a reason to stop playing by his rules." He looked over at Leo, the tiny boy who had survived a war before he could even breathe on his own. "The silence is over, Stephanie. From now on, the only voices they'll hear are ours." The transition from the sterile white of the hospital to the towering glass and reinforced steel of Woobin's private estate happened under the cover of a moonless sky. He had personally overseen the convoy, 5 black SUVs moving in a silent, predatory formation through the winding roads of Bukhansan. To the world, this was the fortress of a king. To Woobin, as he carried the sleeping bundle of his son across the threshold, it was a high-security nursery designed to keep the monsters of his own making at bay. Stephanie walked beside him, her steps slow but steady, supported by the strength of his arm. Inside, the estate had been transformed. The cold, minimalist marble was now softened by plush rugs and the hum of high-end medical monitors relocated for Leo's recovery. But as the heavy steel doors hissed shut, a different kind of tension settled over Woobin, a quiet, paralyzing fear that no amount of firepower could resolve. In the nursery, a room of floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the jagged mountain peaks, Woobin stood over the crib. He had commanded thousands of men, navigated treacherous betrayals, and balanced the economy of the underworld on his fingertips, yet he found himself staring at a diaper and a bottle of warmed milk with a sense of total helplessness. "He's awake," Stephanie whispered, appearing in the doorway. "He needs to be held, Woobin." He looked at his hands, hands that were scarred, hands that knew the weight of a trigger far better than the fragility of a life. "I'll break him," he murmured, his voice cracking in the midnight silence. "You're his father," she countered softly, crossing the room to guide his arms into the proper position. "The same hands that protect us are the ones that will hold him. Just breathe." As Stephanie lowered the infant into his grasp, Woobin's entire body went rigid. Leo was impossibly light, a warm, rhythmic weight against his chest. The boy stirred, his small face scrunched in a silent yawn before his eyes opened, dark, curious, and terrifyingly trusting. In that moment, the glass fortress felt both like a sanctuary and a prison. Woobin realized that while he could build walls to keep his father and his enemies out, he had no defense against the way this child was dismantling him from the inside. For the first time in his life, Woobin didn't check the perimeter cameras or look at the encrypted messages flashing on his phone. He simply sat in the rocking chair, the city lights of Seoul shimmering in the distance like a fading memory of a past life. He was a man of war, learning the quiet language of peace, rocking his son to sleep while the ghosts of his empire prowled outside the glass, waiting for a moment of weakness he was no longer ashamed to possess. The struggle of fatherhood wasn't in the protection, it was in the surrender. The peace of the glass fortress was a fragile illusion, shattered not by an external strike, but by a digital ghost. While Stephanie slept and Leo drifted in a medicated slumber, Woobin sat in his darkened study, his fingers flying across an encrypted laptop. He had bypassed the security firewalls of the Kim family's private server, digging through the layers of administrative archives that his father, Kim Sang-dae, kept as a ledger of control. The file he found was time-stamped exactly 1 year ago. It wasn't a memo or a balance sheet. It was a series of surveillance recordings and a wire transfer titled Project Crucible. He clicked play, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the monitor. On the screen, he saw Stephanie, not the tired, brave woman in the next room, but the vibrant version of her from a year ago. She was being cornered in an underground parking lot by his father's chief enforcer. The audio was crisp. He heard the man's voice, cold and mechanical, explaining that Woobin was softening, that his focus on her was eroding the foundation of the syndicate. Then came the ultimatum: leave and disappear, or the child she was carrying would never see a sunrise. But the final blow came in the form of an audio recording of his father's voice. "A leader cannot have a heart that beats for anyone but the empire," Sang-dae had said. "If he thinks she left him of her own accord, the heartbreak will turn to ice, and ice is harder than flesh. This is not a betrayal, it is his final initiation." Woobin closed the laptop with a slow, trembling hand. The air in the room felt thick with the scent of old blood and rusted iron. His own father hadn't just threatened his family, he had orchestrated a year of psychological torture to harden him, treating his son's soul like a piece of steel to be tempered in the fire of abandonment. Every night Woobin had spent drinking himself into a stupor, every reckless mission he had taken hoping for a bullet to find him had been part of his father's design. The realization didn't bring tears. It brought a terrifying, absolute stillness. The shadows of the father were no longer just a metaphor for his heritage. They were a cage he had finally seen from the outside. He stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city his family had ruled for 3 generations. For years, he had operated under the assumption that loyalty to the bloodline was the highest law. He looked toward the nursery door, where the true heir to his life lay sleeping. His father wanted a monster to lead the syndicate, a man of ice who felt nothing. But Sang-dae had made a fatal calculation. By putting Stephanie and Leo in danger, he hadn't hardened Woobin's heart, he had given it a target. The initiation was over, but the war was just beginning. Woobin picked up his phone and dialed his most trusted lieutenant. "The old guard thinks I'm distracted," Woobin said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Let them keep thinking that. We're moving the assets. We aren't just protecting the estate anymore. We're dismantling the throne." He ended the call and looked at the Glock resting on his desk. The cycle of the Kim family was about to be broken, not with a whimper, but the roar of a father who had nothing left to lose. The attack didn't begin with a gunshot, but with the sudden, haunting silence of the mountain crickets as the estate's perimeter sensors flickered from green to a pulsing, angry red. Inside the glass fortress, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Woobin didn't need to check the monitors. He felt the change in the air pressure as his security team moved into their defensive positions. He was in the nursery, watching the soft rise and fall of Leo's chest when the first muffled thud of a suppressed rifle echoed from the tree line. "Stephanie, get in the panic room, now," Woobin said, his voice a low, terrifying calm. He didn't look back as he pulled a secondary tactical vest over his dress shirt, the contrast of the silk and the Kevlar a grim reflection of his dual life. Stephanie didn't argue. She saw the look in his eyes, the shadow of the man who had built an empire on the bones of his enemies, and she knew that the only way to keep Leo safe was to let the monster out of the cage. She scooped the sleeping infant from the crib, her hands steady despite the tears threatening to spill, and vanished behind the reinforced steel painting that led to the estate's core. As the door hissed shut, the glass walls of the nursery vibrated. A flashbang detonated on the terrace, blooming like a lethal flower in the darkness. Shadowy figures in tactical gear, his father's cleansers, swarmed the glass, their silent precision speaking of years of training. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to remove the liability and bring Woobin back to the throne, alone. Woobin stepped into the center of the nursery, silhouetted against the city lights. He was a lone figure, in a sharp black suit, holding a specialized submachine gun with the practiced ease of a predator. When the first pane of reinforced glass shattered, raining diamonds of safety glass across the floor, Woobin didn't flinch. He opened fire with a surgical, rhythmic grace. The war for the nursery was a brutal, close-quarters dance. Woobin moved through the shadows of his own home like a ghost, using the minimalist furniture as cover. Every time a mercenary breached the threshold, they were met with the unrelenting fury of a father. He wasn't fighting for territory or pride. He was fighting for the quiet, milky scent of his son's head and the way Stephanie looked when she laughed. He intercepted the lead operative in the hallway, the man who had been his father's shadow for a decade. The combat was silent and visceral, a struggle of blades and bone. Woobin took a shallow cut to the shoulder, the white of his shirt staining crimson, but he didn't feel the pain. He drove the man back against the wall, his fingers locking around the operative's throat, with a strength fueled by a year of suppressed rage. "Tell my father," Woobin hissed, his face inches from the man's mask, "that the nursery is holy ground. If he sends one more soul past the gate, I won't just stop his men. I'm coming for his heart." By the time the sun began to bleed over the Bukhansan peaks, the estate was silent once more. The threat had been neutralized, the cleansers broken, and retreating into the morning mist. Woobin stood on the shattered terrace, his suit ruined, his blood dripping onto the marble. He looked back at the panic room door. He had won the battle, but as he felt the cold weight of the weapon in his hand, he realized the fortress was no longer enough. To truly protect the nursery, he had to destroy the world that made it a target. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the vents of the estate, a bitter reminder of the night's violence that no amount of expensive air filtration could mask. Woobin sat at the kitchen island, his wounded shoulder bandaged beneath a fresh white shirt, watching Stephanie pace the length of the marble floor. She wasn't crying anymore. Her eyes were hard, reflecting the cold gray light of a Seoul morning that felt more like an ending than a beginning. In the nursery, Leo was finally quiet, but the silence between the two adults was louder than any explosion. Stephanie stopped her pacing, her gaze fixed on the shattered remains of a glass vase across the room. "He could have died, Woobin," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "Not from a fever or a weak lung, but from a bullet meant for you, or worse, a bullet meant to hurt him through you." "I ended it, Stephanie. They won't come back."
"They will always come back," she snapped, turning to face him. "Your father, his rivals, the next man who wants to prove he's stronger than the great Kim Woobin. This house isn't a sanctuary, it's a bullseye. I spent a year running so he could breathe. I didn't bring him back to life just to watch him become a trophy in a gang war." She walked toward him, leaning over the counter until she was inches from his face, the scent of her lavender perfume clashing with the metallic tang of the room. "I love the man you were when we met, but I will not raise a target. If you want us to stay, if you want to be more than a name on a birth certificate, the syndicate dies today. Not the men, but your involvement. Every ledger, every port, every dirty won. You wash it all, or we vanish again. And this time, you won't find us." The ultimatum hung in the air, a final line in the sand. Woobin looked at the security monitors on the wall, the cameras, the guards, the perimeter that had failed to keep the world out. He thought of his father's voice calling him ice. He thought of Leo's tiny hand around his finger. "It will take time," Woobin said, his voice a low vibration. "Moving assets of this size without triggering a collapse, it's a surgical process. My father will see it as a declaration of total war." "Then let it be war," Stephanie whispered, her hand finally softening as she touched his cheek. "But let it be the last one you ever fight." Woobin stood up, pulling her into his chest. Over her shoulder he caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The great transition had begun. He picked up his phone, but he didn't call his enforcers. He called his lead auditor and his legal counsel. He began the process of hemorrhaging his power, trading his crown for a conscience. He was no longer building an empire. He was dismantling a prison, piece by agonizing piece, hoping that by the time he reached the center, there would still be enough of a man left for her to love. The meeting was set at midnight at an ancient tea house on the outskirts of Seoul, a place where the wood was stained with a century of secrets, and the air smelled of damp earth and charcoal. Woobin arrived alone, leaving his security detail at the gate, a calculated move of both absolute vulnerability and supreme confidence. He stepped over the threshold, his boots silent on the tatami mats, and entered the private room where his father sat waiting. Kim Sang-dae looked like a relic of a dying era, draped in a traditional silk robe, his eyes as cold and unyielding as the mountains surrounding the estate. Beside him sat two other elders of the old guard, their faces etched with the disappointment of men who had watched their greatest investment fail. "You look tired, Woobin," his father said, pouring tea with a hand that didn't shake. "It is what happens when a man tries to carry a heart. It is a heavy, useless weight." Woobin sat across from them, his posture rigid. He didn't touch the tea. "I'm not here to discuss my health, father. I'm here to close the books. The great transition is 70% complete. By the end of the week, the shipping lines, the real estate holdings, the construction syndicates will be under independent, legitimate management. The rest, the things that happen in the dark, I am handing over to the council." A murmur of shock rippled through the elders. To give away an empire was unthinkable. To dismantle it was a sin. "You would abandon your birthright for a woman who fled and a child of mixed blood?" One elder hissed, his voice like dry parchment. "I am not abandoning it," Woobin replied, his voice a low, lethal vibration that made the tea in their cups tremble. "I am buying peace. In exchange for the keys to the kingdom, you will sign the Buried Grudges Pact. You will scrub Stephanie and Leo from the family records. They do not exist to you. They are not targets, they are not leverage, and they are not Kim's. If so much as a shadow falls across my son's path in the next 50 years, the remaining 30% of my assets, the private security firms and the black site data will be triggered to destroy every man in this room." His father put down the teapot, finally looking his son in the eye. He saw the ice he had wanted, but it wasn't the coldness of a subordinate. It was the absolute zero of a man who had found something more important than power. "You are willing to walk away with nothing? To be a common man?" "I am walking away with everything," Woobin said, standing up. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single, heavy folder, the signed deeds of his resignation. He dropped it on the low table with a final, echoing thud. For the first time, Sang-dae looked at his son not as a tool, but as a force he could no longer control. The debt was settled. The power was traded. As Woobin walked out into the cool night air, he felt the heavy mantle of the syndicate slip from his shoulders. He was a man without a kingdom, heading home to a nursery that was finally, truly safe. 10 years later, the morning sun over Seoul didn't look like a threat. It looked like a promise. Kim Woobin stood on the terrace of his home, not the glass fortress of his past, but a sprawling, sun-drenched estate, where the gardens were filled with the scent of blooming jasmine instead of the cold tang of gunpowder. He was no longer wearing a tactical vest or a sharp charcoal black suit meant for intimidation. Today, he wore a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal scars that had faded into the stories of a previous life. Below him, on the manicured lawn, the new dynasty was in full swing. Leo, now a spirited 10-year-old with his father's sharp eyes and his mother's radiant smile, was coaching his younger sister, Hana, on how to kick a soccer ball. Their laughter echoed up the valley, a sound more powerful than any decree Woobin had ever issued from a throne of shadows. Stephanie stepped out onto the terrace, resting her chin on Woobin's shoulder. She looked vibrant, the lines of worry that had once etched her face in the hospital wing long replaced by the soft glow of a woman who had won her peace. "They're getting faster," she murmured, watching Leo outmaneuver the family's golden retriever.
"He has his mother's persistence," Woobin replied, wrapping an arm around her waist. He thought back to that 4:03 a.m. phone call, the night his world had shattered, only to be rebuilt into something indestructible. He had spent the first half of his life building an empire of fear, believing that power was found in the ability to destroy. But standing here, watching his children play in a world where they didn't know the weight of a Glock or the name of a syndicate, he realized he had been wrong. The Great Transition hadn't just been about cleaning the money or signing over the ports. It had been about cleaning his soul. He had traded the cold silence of the penthouse for the chaotic, beautiful noise of a home. He had traded the loyalty of men who feared him for the love of a family that truly knew him. A phone buzzed on the patio table. For a split second, the old instinct flared, the phantom itch of a man waiting for a crisis. But when he picked it up, there was no report of a coup or a shipment lost at sea. It was a reminder for Hana's piano recital later that evening. Woobin smiled, a genuine, unburdened expression that would have been unrecognizable to the old guard. The Kim name was no longer a shadow over the city. It was a legacy of legitimacy and light. As Leo scored a goal and let out a triumphant shout, Woobin realized that the empire he had built with Stephanie wasn't made of steel and marble. It was an empire of second chances, founded on a 4:03 a.m. whisper and sustained by the simple, profound act of staying. "Come on, Dad," Leo called out from below, waving him toward the grass. "You promised you'd play." Woobin looked at Stephanie, kissed her temple, and started down the stairs. The king was dead, and the father had finally found his kingdom.